Welcome to Tale Grove, where every story grows roots, and every lesson touches the heart.
Sometimes, the most unexpected decisions change a person's life forever. This story begins with a wealthy woman who had everything money could buy, yet she felt completely alone. Victoria Adams was known across the city as a powerful and successful businesswoman. She owned luxury apartments, drove expensive cars, and lived in a beautiful mansion. But behind all that wealth was a painful truth. Every family gathering reminded her of the same thing: she was still single. Her relatives whispered about it. Some mocked her openly. Rich, successful, but no man wants her, they would say. Victoria pretended not to care, but deep inside, those words hurt more than anyone realized. One evening, while driving through the busy streets after a long day at work, she stopped at a traffic light. Outside her car window sat a quiet street beggar. His clothes were dusty and worn, but something about him was different. He looked calm, dignified, almost mysterious. Victoria studied his face for a moment. Then suddenly, a strange idea entered her mind. An idea so unexpected, it would change both their lives forever. She slowly rolled down the car window and called out to him. "Excuse me. I need your help." The beggar looked up, surprised. He had no idea that the next few words from this rich stranger were about to turn his world upside down. If this story made you think, follow for more life lessons. Victoria sat quietly on the large cream-colored couch in her family's living room, staring at her phone but not really reading anything on the screen. The house was beautiful: marble floors, tall glass windows, expensive decorations, but none of it could stop the uncomfortable feeling building in her chest. Across the room, several relatives were chatting and laughing loudly. The conversation slowly shifted toward weddings and relationships, something Victoria had learned to dread. Then Cynthia's voice cut through the room like a sharp knife. "Well," Cynthia said with a smirk, crossing her legs confidently, "some people here have everything, except someone who actually wants to marry them." A few cousins exchanged awkward looks. Everyone knew exactly who she was talking about. Victoria slowly lifted her eyes from her phone. "Cynthia," she said calmly, "if you have something to say, just say it directly." Cynthia smiled wider, clearly enjoying the moment. "Oh, I'm just saying," she continued, pretending to fix her hair. "You're the richest woman in this family, Victoria. Big business, big house, big car, yet no man has ever stayed long enough to marry you. Isn't that strange?" A few quiet laughs came from the corner of the room. Victoria felt her stomach tighten, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Maybe," Victoria replied softly, "I just haven't met the right person yet." Cynthia laughed loudly. "Or maybe," she said, leaning forward, "men are just afraid of strong women like you. Or worse, maybe they simply don't love you." The room suddenly went silent. Victoria's fingers tightened around her phone. Before she could respond, her mother, Mrs. Evelyn, stepped in. "That's enough, Cynthia," she said firmly. "You shouldn't talk to your cousin that way." But Cynthia only shrugged. "I'm just telling the truth, Auntie. Look at me," she said proudly. "My fiancé is flying in next month. We're getting married soon." She looked directly at Victoria. "Meanwhile, you're still showing up to family events alone." Victoria stood up slowly, trying to hide the storm of emotions rising inside her. "Excuse me," she said quietly. She walked toward the hallway, but her mother followed her into the kitchen a moment later. "Victoria," her mother sighed gently. "You know Cynthia likes to talk too much. Don't take it to heart." Victoria leaned against the counter, her voice slightly shaking. "But she's right, Mom," she admitted. "Everyone in the family is getting married. Everyone except me." Her mother hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Your father and I are not getting younger," she said softly. "We would really love to see you settle down, maybe even give us grandchildren." Victoria looked away, feeling the pressure closing in around her. Everywhere she turned, the same expectation followed her. Marriage. Love. A partner. And suddenly, for the first time in her life, Victoria felt truly tired of being the only one without someone by her side. 2 days after the uncomfortable family gathering, Victoria was still thinking about Cynthia's cruel words. They kept echoing in her mind like a song she couldn't turn off. Rich but alone, no man wants you. The thought irritated her more than she wanted to admit. Late that evening, Victoria left the office after a long meeting and drove through the busy streets of the city. The traffic lights ahead turned red, forcing her to stop. She leaned back in her seat, tired, her fingers tapping lightly on the steering wheel. Then something outside her window caught her attention. On the roadside, sitting quietly near a small streetlight, was a man. His clothes were old and dusty. A small metal tin sat on the ground beside him, holding a few coins. A beggar. Normally Victoria wouldn't even look twice. But something about him made her pause. He wasn't shouting or begging loudly like the others nearby. He simply sat there, calm and silent. Curious, Victoria looked at him again. Despite the worn clothes and messy hair, his face was surprisingly handsome. His posture was straight, and his eyes seemed thoughtful rather than desperate. Almost dignified. The man noticed her gaze and looked up politely. "Good evening, madam," he said gently. Victoria hesitated for a moment, then slowly rolled down her car window. "Do you sit here every day?" she asked. The man nodded slightly. "Yes, madam. This corner is usually quiet." His voice was calm and respectful. Victoria studied him carefully. A strange idea began forming in her mind. At first, she tried to ignore it. It sounded ridiculous. Crazy even. But the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. Finally, she spoke again. "What's your name?" she asked. "Daniel," he replied. Victoria took a deep breath. "Daniel," she said slowly, "how would you like to earn a lot of money?" Daniel looked confused. "Money?" he repeated. "Yes," she said. "But you have to help me with something first." He shifted. Slightly, unsure. "What kind of help?" Victoria leaned slightly closer to the window. "I need someone to pretend to be my fiancé," she said. Daniel blinked in shock. "Your fiancé?" "Yes," Victoria said firmly. "There's a family event coming soon, and I need someone by my side. Just for a few days. That's all." Daniel stared at her as if he wasn't sure he heard correctly. "Madam. I'm a beggar," he said quietly. "Your family will know immediately that I don't belong in your world." Victoria smiled slightly. "That's where I come in." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a thick envelope. "There's $10,000 in here," she said. "Half now, half after the event." Daniel's eyes widened. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Victoria could almost hear the thoughts racing through his mind. Finally, he spoke again. "And what exactly would I have to do?" Victoria leaned back in her seat with a confident smile. "Just trust me," she said. "By the time I'm done with you, no one will ever guess you were a beggar." The next morning, Daniel woke up in a place that felt like a dream. For the first time in years, he had slept on a soft bed. The room was quiet, clean, and smelled faintly of fresh flowers. Sunlight slipped through the large curtains, lighting up the elegant guest room of Victoria's mansion. For a moment, Daniel wondered if everything that had happened the night before was just a strange dream. But then he heard a knock on the door. "Daniel, are you awake?" Victoria's voice called from outside. "Yes. I'm coming," he replied. He opened the door slowly. Victoria stood there holding several shopping bags and a towel. She looked at him carefully and smiled. Today, she said confidently, we begin your transformation. Daniel raised an eyebrow. My transformation? Victoria handed him the towel. Step 1, she said. A long shower. Daniel chuckled softly. I guess that makes sense. After the shower, Daniel stepped out wearing the clean clothes Victoria had given him. His hair was still messy, but already he looked different. Victoria studied him thoughtfully. Not bad, she murmured. But we still have a lot of work to do. An hour later, they arrived at a luxury salon in the city. The moment Daniel walked inside, several stylists looked at him with curiosity. His simple clothes didn't match the expensive place. Victoria clapped her hands once to get everyone's attention. I want the best treatment for him, she said firmly. Haircut, beard trim, facial, everything. The workers nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. Daniel sat nervously in the chair as the stylists began their work. His hair was washed, trimmed, and styled neatly. His beard was carefully shaped. His face was cleaned and treated until his skin looked fresh and healthy. Nearly 2 hours later, one of the salon workers turned the chair toward the mirror. Daniel blinked. For a moment, he didn't recognize the man staring back at him. His hair was perfectly styled. His beard was neat. His face looked confident and refined. Victoria folded her arms and stared. Wow, she whispered. Daniel turned to her with a playful smile. Is that a compliment? Victoria cleared her throat quickly. Don't get used to it, she said, trying to hide her surprise. But inside, she was shocked. The man sitting in front of her no longer looked like a street beggar. He looked like someone who could easily walk into a boardroom full of executives. Their next stop was an expensive clothing boutique. Victoria picked out several suits, dress shirts, and polished shoes while the shop assistants watched in amazement. When Daniel finally stepped out of the dressing room wearing a fitted black suit, the entire store fell silent. Victoria stared at him for a long moment. Then she smiled slowly. Perfect, she said. Daniel looked down at the suit. I've never worn something like this before. Victoria adjusted his tie slightly. Well, she said softly, get used to it. She stepped back and admired her work. Because standing in front of her now was no longer a man from the street. He looked like a man who belonged among the rich and powerful. The day of the family reunion finally arrived. Victoria stood in front of the large mirror in her bedroom, adjusting the necklace around her neck. Her heart was beating faster than usual. Tonight was the moment she would prove everyone wrong. Behind her, Daniel stepped into the room wearing the dark blue suit Victoria had chosen for him. His hair was neatly styled, and his posture was calm and confident. Victoria turned around and stared for a moment. Even she was still surprised by how different he looked. You look perfect, she admitted quietly. Daniel smiled slightly. I hope your family thinks so too. Victoria picked up her handbag and walked toward the door. Just remember everything I taught you, she said. You're a businessman who owns a tech company. We've been dating for 6 months. Daniel nodded calmly. Don't worry, he replied. I won't embarrass you. An hour later, their cars slowly entered the large compound where the reunion was being held. The place was full of expensive cars, loud music, and relatives chatting happily. The moment Victoria stepped out of the car holding Daniel's arm, several heads turned. Whispers spread through the crowd. Who is that man with Victoria? He's handsome. Is that her boyfriend? Inside the house, Cynthia was laughing loudly with a group of cousins when someone suddenly called her name. Cynthia, look. She turned toward the entrance. Her smile froze. Victoria walked confidently into the room, holding Daniel's arm. The mysterious man beside her looked calm, elegant, and incredibly handsome. For a moment, the entire room went silent. Victoria's mother stood up immediately, her eyes wide with surprise. "Victoria, you came," she said warmly. Victoria smiled. "Of course, Mom." She gently pulled Daniel forward. "Everyone," she announced, "this is Daniel, my fiancé." Gasps filled the room. "Fiancé," someone whispered. Cynthia's face turned pale. Her eyes moved slowly from Victoria to Daniel, studying him carefully. Something about him didn't make sense. Just a few weeks ago, Victoria had no boyfriend. Now she suddenly appeared with a man who looked like he belonged on the cover of a magazine. Cynthia forced a smile and walked closer. "Well, Victoria," she said sweetly, though her voice carried a hint of suspicion. "You never told us you were seeing someone." Victoria met her cousin's gaze calmly. "Some surprises are better revealed in person," she replied. Daniel extended his hand politely. "Nice to meet you," he said. Cynthia shook his hand slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Nice to meet you too," she replied. But inside her mind, a question kept repeating. Who is this man, really? The reunion was now in full swing. Music played softly in the background while relatives laughed, ate, and chatted around the large garden tables. Victoria sat beside Daniel, occasionally introducing him to different family members. Surprisingly, he handled every conversation with calm confidence. "So Daniel, what exactly do you do?" one uncle asked curiously. Daniel smiled politely. "I run a small technology company," he replied smoothly. Victoria glanced at him and nodded approvingly. He remembered the story perfectly. But across the room, Cynthia was watching them closely. Something about Daniel felt unusual. How can a beggar suddenly behave like this? She thought suspiciously. Meanwhile, Daniel's phone suddenly vibrated in his pocket. He frowned slightly when he saw the caller ID. Victoria noticed immediately. "Everything okay?" she asked quietly. Daniel hesitated for a moment. "Yes. I just need to take this call," he said. He stood up calmly. "Excuse me." Daniel walked away from the crowd and moved toward the quiet corner of the garden where the lights were dim. Once he was sure no one could hear him, he answered the phone. "Yes." The voice on the other end sounded anxious. "Sir, where are you?" the man asked. "We've been trying to reach you all evening." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "I told you I'm taking a few days off," he said calmly. "But sir, the investors are waiting," the assistant continued nervously. "The board meeting starts in less than an hour. They need your approval for the Singapore project." Daniel sighed softly. "I'll handle it later," he replied. "Sir, this deal is worth over $200 million, the assistant insisted. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "I said I will handle it later," he repeated firmly. There was a brief silence. "Yes, sir," the assistant said quickly. Daniel ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring at the dark sky. His secret life was slowly catching up with him. Back at the table, Victoria watched him from across the garden. She noticed the serious look on his face. Something about that phone call didn't feel normal. When Daniel returned a minute later, she tilted her head slightly. "Everything okay?" she asked again. Daniel smiled gently. "Just work," he replied. Victoria nodded slowly, but deep down she felt a small spark of curiosity. Because for a man who claimed to be a former beggar, Daniel seemed to receive some very important phone calls. Later that night, the family reunion finally came to an end. The loud laughter, music, and endless conversations slowly faded as relatives began leaving the house. Victoria and Daniel drove back to her mansion in near silence. The soft glow of the streetlights passed across the windshield as Victoria focused on the road. But her mind wasn't on driving. It was on Daniel. That phone call earlier, the way someone had called him sir, the way he spoke with quiet authority. Something about it didn't match the story of a man who used to sit on the street begging. When they arrived home, Victoria parked the car and stepped out slowly. Daniel followed her inside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "Victoria, we need to talk." She turned to face him. Her heart suddenly felt heavy. "About what?" she asked softly. Daniel took a deep breath. "I owe you the truth," he said. Victoria crossed her arms, sensing something serious. "What truth?" Daniel looked directly into her eyes. "My name isn't just Daniel," he said quietly. "It's Daniel Edwards." Victoria frowned slightly. "That name sounds familiar." Daniel gave a small, uneasy smile. "It should." He walked toward the living room table, picked up a remote control, and turned on the large television mounted on the wall. Within seconds, a business news channel appeared on the screen. A headline flashed across the bottom. "Tech billionaire Daniel Edwards missing from public eye for several days." Victoria's eyes widened. The screen showed a photo of Daniel wearing a suit, standing in front of a large company building. It was the same man standing in front of her now. Victoria slowly turned to look at him again. "No," she whispered. Daniel nodded gently. "Yes." She stepped back in disbelief. "You're telling me, you're that Daniel Edwards? The billionaire CEO?" Daniel lowered his head slightly. "Yes." Victoria shook her head, trying to process everything. Life always teaches us in unexpected ways. If this story made you think, subscribe for more lessons like this. "But, why?" she asked. "Why were you pretending to be a beggar?" Daniel sighed softly. "Because I was tired of people loving my money instead of loving me," he explained. He walked closer, his voice calm but honest. "For years, everyone treated me like a walking bank account. Friends, partners, even women who claimed they loved me." He paused for a moment. "So I decided to disappear for a while, to see how people treat someone with nothing." Victoria stared at him silently. "And then I met you," Daniel continued. "You didn't know who I was. You didn't care about money. You just needed help, and you treated me like a human being." Victoria felt a wave of emotions rushing through her chest. Shock. Confusion. But also something deeper. Daniel looked at her gently. "And somewhere along the way, I realized something else." Victoria's voice trembled slightly. "What?" Daniel smiled softly. "I fell in love with you." Victoria stood frozen in the middle of the living room, her mind still trying to process everything Daniel had just revealed. The man she had picked from the street, the man she believed was a struggling beggar, was actually one of the most powerful billionaires in the world. Her heart was racing. "You're serious?" she whispered softly. Daniel nodded gently, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I've never been more serious about anything in my life." Victoria walked slowly toward the couch and sat down, covering her mouth with her hand. For a moment, she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "I can't believe this," she said quietly. "All this time. I thought I was helping you." Daniel chuckled softly and sat beside her. "In a way, you were," he said. She looked at him, confused. "How?" Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "You helped me remember something I had forgotten," he explained. "What?" "That kindness still exists," he replied. Victoria's eyes softened. "You treated me like a human being when you believed I had nothing," Daniel continued. "You didn't care about my money, my status, or my reputation. You simply saw a man who needed help." He looked directly into her eyes. "And that meant more to me than you can imagine." Victoria felt warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time since hearing the truth, she smiled. "So, you're not angry that I hired you to pretend to be my fiancé?" she asked playfully. Daniel laughed. "Honestly," he said, "that might be the craziest thing anyone has ever asked me to do." Victoria laughed too. "But it worked," she said proudly. Daniel nodded. "Yes, it did." For a moment, the room fell quiet again. Then Daniel slowly reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Victoria watched curiously. "What are you doing?" Daniel stood up and turned to face her. Before she could ask another question, he slowly knelt down on one knee. Victoria gasped. "Daniel, what are doing?" He opened a small velvet box. Inside was a beautiful diamond ring that sparkled under the soft lights of the room. Daniel took a deep breath. "Victoria Adams," he said gently. "When we first met, I thought this would just be a short adventure, a funny story I would tell one day." He smiled warmly. "But somewhere along the way, you became the most important person in my life." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "You saw me when the whole world was ignoring the man behind the money," Daniel continued. "And I realized something. I don't want to live another day without you in my life." He held the ring toward her. "Victoria, will you marry me?" For a moment, Victoria could not speak. Tears rolled slowly down her cheeks as she covered her mouth in shock and happiness. Then finally, she laughed through her tears. "Yes," she cried. "Of course I will." Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, and Victoria immediately pulled him into a tight hug. Both of them laughed with pure joy. Because what had started as a crazy plan, had just turned into a real love story. Sometimes, life has a strange way of revealing the truth about people, not through wealth, power, or status, but through the smallest acts of kindness. Victoria never expected that the simple decision to help a man sitting quietly on the street would change her entire life. At that moment, she wasn't thinking about rewards, recognition, or consequences. She simply saw someone who looked tired, lonely, and forgotten by the world. And in that moment, she chose compassion. What she didn't know was that the man she helped, Daniel, had everything the world usually admires: money, influence, success, and power. Yet despite all those things, he had been searching for something far more valuable. Something money could never buy. Genuine kindness. Daniel had spent years surrounded by people who admired his wealth but rarely cared about him as a person. Conversations often revolved around business deals, profits, or social status. But when Victoria spoke to him for the first time, there were no expectations, no calculations, and no hidden motives. She simply treated him like a human being. And sometimes, that simple act can mean more than grand gestures. The truth is, we often judge people based on appearances. A worn coat, tired eyes, or a quiet presence can make someone invisible in a busy world. But behind every face is a story we may never fully understand. Daniel looked like a man who had nothing, yet he had everything. And Victoria thought she was helping someone less fortunate, but in reality, she was revealing the best parts of her own character. Kindness has a way of returning to us in unexpected forms. Not always through wealth or opportunity, but through relationships, trust, and the rare moments when two lives connect in a meaningful way. Victoria didn't help Daniel because he was rich. And Daniel didn't fall in love with Victoria because she was impressive. They chose each other because they saw the truth behind the surface. Because in a world that often values money and status, the most powerful quality a person can have is still the simplest one of all: a kind heart. And perhaps the real lesson of this story is this: you never truly know who someone is, or how important a single act of kindness might become. So treat people with respect. Offer kindness when you can. Because sometimes, the smallest moment of compassion can lead to the greatest story of all. What would you have done in this situation? Tell us in the comments, and subscribe for more meaningful stories like this.